Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to our next live session of Avid Online. For those who are joining us for the first time, a special welcome to you, and please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning and the work that we do. We've used these extraordinary circumstances of 2020 to transition our programming online. Our digital further learning campaign, Avid Online, started on April 1st, is now almost a year old, or should I say young. And in this time, we've curated and presented over close to 240 programs. We're committed to continuing our support to the arts and maintain our connections with the creative communities, facilitate learning, and continuous dialogue with our audiences. So whether we continue online, transition to physical events, or a hybrid mix of both, we stay true to our mantra that learning never stops. To mark World Poetry Day 2021 and to celebrate the digital launch of Hunchprose, the latest poetic opus by poet and cultural theorist Ranjit Hoskote, Penguin Random House India, Literature Live, Kitab Khana, and Avid Learning present The Power of the Poetic Word, New Directions in Poetry, a live session around the book and on the future of poetry. The author will be in conversation with poet, novelist, and dancer Tishani Doshi. For more about our very impressive speakers, please refer to the equally impressive bios that have been posted in the chat section. Ranjit has been a supporter, collaborator, and a friend of Avid since our inception almost 12 years ago. And together we've presented, and I was telling him this earlier, countless series, panels, workshops, festivals. So it's our absolute honor tonight to present this session to mark the launch of his latest book, and would like to congratulate Ranjit and wish him very much of success, or actually continued success, because he's very successful. So tonight, Ranjit and Tishani will discuss the range and power of the poetic word, poetry's gift for creating afterlives and survive chaos, and its response to the challenges of the new normal. Please note that this session will last about 75 minutes, followed by a Q&A, where they will be taking questions. So please keep posting them in the Q&A box throughout. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in. Over to you, Tishani, to level set and look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. And hi, Ranjit.
Hi, Tishani.
So I'm just gonna dive right in without any great formalities. I've spent some time with this beautiful book for more than a week now. And as I was reading the poems, I wrote down some keywords, let's say, as I was going through. Words that either appeared in your poems, mostly those, but also maybe some that occurred to me. And it kind of made a poem itself. So they are home, walking, belonging, boats, migration, movement, story, visitor, pilgrim, driftwood, seeking, wandering, home, silence, seen, unseen, micro, macro, illusion, song, meaning, thought, gaps, language, song, voice, guest, ghost, home. So
that's wonderful.
These are all from your, these are just words extracted from your poems. And it seems to me, I think that as poets, we have preoccupations and obsessions, and some continue throughout our artistic journeys and we never let go of them. Others come and go. But to me, for this book really revolves very much around the idea of transience, journeys, home, some kind of search. And I think I'd like to start by getting you to talk a little bit about the motivations behind some of these poems, and what what are some of these directions regarding home and the journey and the migrants and all of those words that I just brought up. Big question to start with.
Which we'll begin by thinking about our locations, maybe. Tishani, in the first place, thank you so much for the attentiveness that you've brought to this book, because that's really the finest gift that a poet can hope to receive from a fellow poet. So I'm really, really deeply appreciative of this. And this garland of words that you shared, which is like a performance in itself, it even to me, it kind of reinforced what the recurrent themes of the book are. And also, it struck me as you were speaking that we both live on coasts. I'm here on the West Coast, and you're on the East Coast of India. And each of us has a proximate urban history, as well as this larger history of navigation, travel, displacement, multiple languages, multiple ancestries to draw on. And I have a sense that at least part of my story has to do with growing up in this kind of way, on the coast, very aware of being part of a city that's a crucible for dissimilar, diverse energies to come together. And at the same time, drawing on a diasporic history within South Asia, which on the one hand might seem like a history of displacements, but on the other allows me to really function across languages, across regions, without having to sit quietly in some kind of preordained box of identity. So I think that's one of the key impulses for me, whether it's in my poetry or in the writing I do on cultural history, for instance. And I think that is, to me, extremely important at a time when there is immense external pressure on all of us to belong either to us or them, or take your stand on one or another side. And I think we need to reject these binaries. So the voyager, the survivor, the explorer, all of these figures who push up against borders and, seek the uncharted, these have always been figures I've responded very strongly to.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because just your response brings up a few other questions in my head. You mentioned the word history a lot, and I want you to talk about history a little later. But I think as well, I'm interested in, you use voice, you use song. So I read these poems as a kind of ars poetica, the idea of what is your practice with poetry, what is your poetry trying to do. But there's also this sense of voices in the poem, and there's like a real plurality of voice, because I feel like you are, like, there are a lot of pronouns and I'm not sure who they are. There's man with parrots, there's the Siddhi Mubarak that you start off the poem with, and we meet many journeys, many journeyers, let's say, in the pages of the poem. And one must assume that some of these are you, but also you as a person identifying. So I'm interested in that question of poetic voice and what it means to respond to this idea of journey in a sort of almost dramatic monologue way, or otherwise.
Tishani, I think for me, a lot of this springs from my dissatisfaction with a certain kind of personal lyric, or also the idea that many of us were given early in our education, in our early socialization in the literary world, this idea that you have to find a voice, and having found it, somehow secure and guard it. Seems to me that we are all highly kaleidoscopic people. And over the years, this has become a conviction with me. And I feel that it's when we explore this diversity within ourselves that really we're going to find something that isn't a singular voice, but what it is some kind of ability to release oneself through empathy, through curiosity, through mutuality to other people and their predicaments. And for me, that is, if you will, if it's not overloading this simple idea, it's a kind of ethic. It's certainly a kind of politics. And increasingly in a world that is so vexed and threatened as ours is, largely by factors we've produced ourselves, it's to me a question of how one reaches out to other people's predicaments. And rather than remaining caught up in one's own citadel, how does one do this? It's also got to do, I think, with the shift in my own perceptions of what we as Anglophone Indian poets are all about. For the longest time, there was, for me at least, and I think for many people, maybe in our generation, this very defensive sense that Since the nativists didn't really feel we were authentic, that we didn't really belong, that we were somehow a relic of colonial history, now we needed to entrench ourselves in our linguistic choice. And increasingly, it seems to me that this is probably a needless debate. And I just found myself opening up to other parts of myself, which had kind of kept at a removed from my poetry. So Hindustani classical music, for instance. In recent time, both in Jonah Whale, the earlier book, and this one, there's a strong sense of the bandish, even if it's not present as such, the song text. Also, I drew on an experiment that went nowhere for me, as I thought, working on a libretto with Banraj Bhatia for Agni Varsha, Girish Karnad's play. I mean, I did that like over a decade ago. And then it was one of those projects that just sat there, and I didn't realize that it actually began to work for me. So the idea of the polyphony, the libretto, the poem, a score, a lot of that has now come into play. It's been like a slow release for me, but that's another way in which I approach this question of the many voices now in my poetry.
And you brought up that very interesting word collective, which I feel this entire experience of pandemic has become my key word in a way. One of the key words is this question of, in a hyper individualized society where the individual has been given so much prominence and so much of space to stress your individuality, it is really broken down in this context where you understand that you actually don't exist alone, that you are part of a collective, and what you do can affect other people. And so this notion of collectivity has really been playing in my head, and the question of community. And when you were talking about these things, I was, of course, thinking about your wonderful introduction to Ailala. And, that's another companion that's been with me, her poems. And you said something so interesting. You said something about her voice, the voice that emerges from the Vaks is who we would collectively call Lala. Like, there's not a person in history who wrote all these poems. So that sense that the poet is not completely working individually or alone, and somehow is, I don't know, maybe you can pick it up if you see where I'm going with
absolutely.
this. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. I mean, I know we have this in common, fascination with Lala. For me, it was really a conclusion I came to from just reading the Vaks over and over again and realizing that they really came from different periods. They had different emphases. I mean, within that very precise metric, the metrical structure of the Vak, it was very, very clear from internal evidence that some of those poems couldn't possibly have been written in the 14th century. They make references to forms of revenue collection, forms of political organization, forms of punishment, which didn't exist earlier. Or they had Persian or Arabic loan words to offer a few linguistic traces. But increasingly it became very, very clear to me that this really was the work of generations and generations of anonymous contributors across gender, across religion, across caste lines. They could be peasants, they could be scribes, pundits, Muslims, men, women. And that to me was the great glory of this text. And that's why I find all these arguments about what is authentic, what is an interpolation, who really wrote these questions become somewhat meaningless when you think about how powerfully important and vital the Vaks have been to the people of Kashmir. And in a sense, they are a portrait, they're a group portrait of Kashmir. They speak of the anguish and the exhilaration of a people and a place. And you're absolutely right. And of course, it's composed under the signature of Lala. But it reminds us, as you say, that even if we don't go around attributing credit for what goes into us, I think it's Linda Hess who translates one of Kabir's lines in this way: this body has many owners. So, I think,
Lovely.
yeah, isn't it? So I think this act of acknowledgement of of the different impulses that go into our work. I think that's crucial at this time.
Yeah, and it lends a kind of power to the poetry because there's this sense of uh, the speaking, not to the individual experience but to a collective. So even if it's individual, it can connect to the universal. So I was really seeing this play of opposites with, the micro and the macro. Then you go like there's a lot of archaeological references, a lot of digging down into the dirt, and then suddenly it's like planetary cosmos, and the eye is forced to go up and away, and and I love that scale, even history, which I will ask you to speak about, that sense that you could be looking at something very ordinary, very basic. And of course, we know that in the ordinary, there is the sacred. God lives in the pots and pans. But also that sense of time really being so mysterious. And, you have, I think in these poems, created a lot of them have that kind of utterance, Bach like quality, just in the space around the page and in the utterance quality of it. So that's more of a comment, and rather than asking you to respond to it. But before we go further, I think it's really important that we talk about the title.
Okay.
It's a curious title, and it's sort of, maybe you could read the poem, and if you want to read a few poems and then talk about it, because I feel like in a way it's a little riddle. I'm not sure that I've solved it after having read the book a few times. So I think it would be great to hear you speak about the poem, the title poem.
Sure. Should I say a few things first and then read the poem?
As you wish.
Okay. It came to me from a sense of being somewhat embattled as a practitioner of poetry, because you're often told that poetry is marginal, elitist, a minority interest, that it's lost the place it once had in culture at large. Then there's suddenly another school of thought which assures you that, poetry is the acme of literary effort and so on and so forth. But I just kept thinking, as I was working on the book, it just kept coming to me again and again. How do we as poets claim the attention of our readers, of the public sphere, if you will, when we're just shaped and seized by the news cycle, by the buzz of data, by the rigorous claims of nonfiction, by the seductions of fiction? How do we find our place? So I began to envision us, poets, or the poet, as some kind of ill-favored, ill-starred, deformed, cousin gone wrong of prose, so Hunchprose, that sort of thing. And by the kind of association of ideas that we all work with, it brought me back to a figure that's haunted me forever, which is Quasimodo from Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I've been fascinated ever since I read the book pretty early on. Books release themselves, as you know, to us over the years in different ways, but I was always struck that this ill-favored figure also made this incredibly beautiful music, the carillon of bells that he sets off. And he's this amazing bell ringer who also has this kind of strange aesthetic ambivalence and dissonance. So these are some of the thoughts that go into Hunchprose. And when I wrote the poem, which I will now read, it's a kind of playful monologue. I suppose it's addressed to readers, as indeed all poems are and should be. So here goes Hunchprose. He calls me Hunchprose, but what's a word between murderous rivals? Across from me he strops his fine blade, smooth talker, barefaced liar, piss-fart, teller of tall tales who wraps you up in his flying carpet, serves you snake oil, carries off the princess every time. And I, what can I offer you except fraying knots, coiled riddles, scrolled bones, keys to doors that were carted away by raiders, betrayed by splayed light and early snow, Lost doors I could have opened with my breath. Call me Hunchprose. I bend over my ink drift words, and when I spring back up, I sting.
Great. It also has a kind of echo with "Call Me Ishmael."
Very much so. And Ishmael was very present in Jonah Whale.
Yeah,
Ishmael
yeah,
and Ahab and those stories of the sea. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It also there. I think there was a Martin Amis story. I'm forgetting now the title of it, but it's like in a world that's gone topsy turvy, and somehow the poets are in the upper echelon. So they're the ones being jetted around on first class, and the poets are in demand, and then the fiction writers are slogging it out, or the screenwriters, or something like that, in a different parallel universe. Obviously, not this one.
Indeed.
Um, Great. Okay, so yeah, I think maybe talk a little bit about this impulse of addressing the element of ars poetica, the idea of directly addressing the reader in a lot of these poems, the function of poetry. I noticed that a lot of critics have said that this is your most urgent collection yet. I don't know, I guess we always feel that the poems we're writing are urgent. But I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about at least that sense of the feeling the need, as you said, in your practice to put poetry in a particular place, and your practice in a
Sure.
place where you have that platform.
Yes. Uh, Tishani, thank you so much for flagging the Ars Poetica aspect of this collection, particularly, because that's been an impulse that's been growing for me. It was present in Jonah Whale to a certain extent, where I think I was working in the aftermath of a certain kind of romanticism, something that speaks of the heroic individual figure uh, in relationship to the cosmos, to nature, and recognizing that this really can't be the heroic adventure that it might have seemed to be in the 19th century. So questions of catastrophe and how one makes art out of it are already present in Jonah Whale. In this book, I think there is an attempt, modest enough, to wrestle with those questions and to also draw on other traditions, if you will. I think it's been really, really important. You flagged Lala earlier, and I think for me it's been vital to have gone through that experience of translation. And as a translator, I think I have gone into a space of humility, and I don't think you can translate without a spirit of humility. You're in the face of someone else's work, someone else's imagination, another context, and you're learning from it as you try and bring it over into your own language. And that's I think that's a sort of tonality that I find here. And in terms of an ars poetica, yes, I think it's a question of how might we sing again? How might we sing of what is going wrong? And yet, how might we sing of ways in which we might mend things that we ourselves have broken? How might we redeem? How might we retrieve? I think these are questions that inform this book. And I've also, through the course of this book, really try to bear witness also to what I've learned from other art forms. I mean, we both have hybrid practices. You are also a dancer. I have been preoccupied with the visual arts. And in this book, again, I think there's been an attempt to really go back to the artisanal fundamental activities. How does one make? How does one speak of what one has made? How does one bridge the distance between artwork and audience? Really, I've just found myself thinking a lot. I wouldn't say thinking because that suggests a kind of sovereign instrumental reason. I've been sensing my way into the practices of musicians, for instance, or potters, and just allowing myself to retrieve all this from other parts of my life and to let all that breathe into my poems.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, there's that sense of, obviously you have a very strong relationship with the visual because you started as a painter, right? Did you?
Well, I used to
Am I
paint as
reading
a
it?
child.
You used to
Yes,
paint. Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have such a, a lot of the poems are dedicated to painters, and so there is that relationship with the visual. But as you say, there's also music is very strong, and the plotters, and so that sense of what it means to make a poem. And I think the voice is very interesting because it's like you have different poems that shift around. There's not like a this is how it's done. And I think I'm interested now in hearing a little bit about the question of history, because it's so the idea of a kind of memory, archaeology, history, archive. These are things that you've done exhibitions on, that you've written about. They're there in your poems, and I wonder whether that can speak to what you just spoke about poetry and what poetry is trying to do now, which is how do we mend things, and does that link back to somehow understanding where we've come from,
Yeah.
maybe?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, let me try and respond to the different aspects of your question. I think for me, there is a continuous sense that we have to struggle against the kind of flattening, the singularity, the neat binaries that are imposed on us. And they always were present in some subliminal form. Now they're rising to the level of state doctrine. And everything about our history tells us that this was never the case. Now, we have plural pasts. We were very multilingual people until quite recently. We didn't have, we were, I mean, the subcontinent was shaped by migrations, not by people who remained static in one place. Uh, and I really want to retrieve all this. So when I go back to the archive, it's also a sense of going back to a living archive. So one of the exhibitions that I know you have in mind, something I did a few years ago called The Sacred Everyday, was really an attempt to show that this isn't something that's locked up in a museum now. It's, though I fear shortly it will be. The fact is, it's part of our living fabric. It's experientially real. Syncretism, people working across each other's images, languages, and that's something I want us to cherish and to practice. So as a poet now, my question is, how do these impulses come in here? Some of that has come in this book particularly. The linguistic experimentation really draws on recent work I've been doing on in Urdu, translating Mir Taki Mir particularly. I've just been fascinated. The question to me often is, wow, how is this done? How does a little suffix like sa transform the value and tonality of a word? Zara sa, a little, a diaphanous little. So questions like that. How does one bring those kinds of tonalities into one's own language? How does one aim for sentences that can be read in two different ways that add or perplex the reader and hopefully move the reader forward in some ways? These are some of the experiments that I've been working with, but also something you said earlier about digging right down as an archaeologist and then going up into the cosmos. That's uncanny, but the two things that all of us as kids wanted to be many different things, right? But among the things I wanted to be was an archaeologist and then an astronomer. And I was involved with amateur astronomy. But to me, these seem to be truly, truly important metaphors, digging down into deep, deep history, deep geological time, retrieving lost aspects of ourselves. I mean, I don't want to romanticize this. Many things went wrong in history, obviously, but there are other things we could learn and which would expand our consciousness today. And astronomy, because call me a populist if you will, but Carl Sagan's Cosmos was something that really, really was crucial to me as a teenager. And I go back to that image of the pale blue dot. I'm going to paraphrase brutally, but something Sagan says that the further away you go from the earth, the more you realize how insignificant all our feuds and strife and all of this is. And I don't merely think, we all know this to be true. We lose sight of that. And I think it's important to have that larger cosmic view. Uh,
Mm.
I was just reading something today, a paper by Jonathan Lear, which is called uh, We Won't Be Missed. As this species vanishes from its own misdeeds, and there'll be lots of other species who won't miss us. Quite the opposite. It's a sobering realization.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. There's so much there to. I think it's this question of recalibration of vision, right? Like digging down. And this summer, my ophthalmologist was telling me that I have this dry eye or whatever, and he's like, we were meant to be farmers. We were meant to be outside, looking down at the earth and looking at the horizon, not looking at the screen for 10 hours a day. So I said, anyway, now I'm here, so I try to do my eye exercises or whatever. But it's that sense of realizing out of yourself, where are you and where are we?
Yes.
And you mentioned something about the open-endedness, and I don't, maybe you could, I noticed that in the poems there's not much punctuation, so there is this sense of many entry and exit points in the poem. And I have another question, which might be somewhat, I don't know, left field, but I'm sure you can manage it. And that is, how is epiphany important to you as a poet, or no?
It's vital. I had a friend called Melly Gobai, who you may have met in Bombay, a marvelous painter, one of our greatest abstractionists. And he used to read my reviews carefully and give me a kind of cautionary update at the end of the week or month. And he would say, you keep using that word epiphany or epiphanic. And I would say, sorry about that, but it's really crucial to me. But it's amazing you should say that. Epiphany, I think, is vital. Whether it comes in the form of some kind of donné, a line that floats into your mind, an image that won't go away, something misheard in conversation. I've begun to find that a really fertile ground for the beginnings of poems. You overhear something, you mishear it completely, and you say, well, who cares what they said? This is where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
So, the way disclosures happen, the way the world reveals itself when you're not even prepared for it, I think that's actually vital. So, and it's probably become more and more vital. And in a way, what you've just said, this mise en page, the shape of the poem as it kind of flows, I think it has something to do with this sense of the epiphanic. But also maybe, and again, I don't want to push this too far because I don't want it to seem like I'm, sitting down as a technician of music to do this. But I really respond to notions like laya,
Mm.
the cadence, the flow. I don't have better words with which to say this, but that's what I'm trying to catch quite often in these poems.
Yeah.
Um, how does this thing flow? What is its laya? What is its ebb and flow? What are the tides of the poem?
Mm, mm. And I think, at least I think, that poems, all poems in general, are strange entities because they're very small compared to other kinds of texts, and yet they exist in a kind of different time zone. So you can't race across a poem. You have to immediately alter your relationship to time as soon as you enter the poem in order to be able to be in it, because it's not a newspaper article or something. So even if you are responding to a newspaper article or something that you heard on the street wrongly or whatever, when there is some kind of transformation that is happening in the poem that requires kind of a participation of the reader to alter their time once they
Yes.
get into the poem, which is always something I've thought is very powerful about poetry. Um, I wanted to ask you about the sense of writing, the question of urgency of the poems. I noticed that a lot of that some of the poems were responses to things that you had read about either in books or in articles. One was very beautiful about the longest journey made by an Arctic fox,
That's right.
for instance, which is just stunning when you come to think about it. And what is the process then? and these are mysterious things. I don't think we always know the answers, but the beginning of a poem, where does it begin?
Sometimes with precisely the image. And I was fascinated by this, the journey of the fox. I read about it, I kept reading about it. I thought that I might bear witness to it in some way, but it wasn't clear how. And eventually, it was through a really roundabout sort of route. I was reading on the huge like subcontinent of plastic that's whirling around in the Pacific, as we know. So that, like as though it was some kind of nebula, that became an image that just possessed me. And there was this incredible journey, a transoceanic journey of the Arctic fox that was going on at some level. And then there was an image from a very, very old fragment of mine, because I tend to work with these fragments and notes that just lie there sometimes for 20 or 25 years. And it was, you wouldn't believe this, but that was in a poem that I'd called Rashtra and Gandhari. It was meant to be a poem based on the Mahabharata and had this image of these the king and the queen with their horned crowns, which I think actually came out of Alkazi's production of Andha Yog. And this image of them just, breaking those horned crowns in the sand. That image has been with me forever. And somehow these three things came together. And I have no explanation for how and why these three images, in some sense, chose one another. But that's where the poem came from.
Mm.
Sometimes it's an insistent beat, and you hear the beat, and then you want to set words to it. I think there's a poem called Protest, which is for Sudhir Patwardhan, another dear friend, a painter, a lot of whose work has been about the working class. A lot of whose paintings have been about working class Bombay, the figure of the laboring body. It's not based on any single painting of his. But when I was thinking about his work, there was that insistent beat of the slogan at a gate meeting.
And you use a lot of an anaphora, right? You have the repetition. Yeah, yeah.
I am partial to anaphora.
Would you like to read maybe one of the poems, Protest,
Sure.
or yeah?
Sure. Since we are talking about anaphora, maybe I'll read two anaphoristic poems and hope this works. Where are we? Protest. Okay. This is Protest, which is for Sudhir Patwardhan, and it goes like this. Hand at the gate, fist around the stone. Hand on the placard, fist around the stone. Hand around the flagpole, fist around the stone. Hand around the baton, fist around the stone. Grip the flint edge clarity of breath ebbing from stone. And then I'll read one called Market. Never forget the salt makers. They can trap the sea. Never forget the makers of flint knives. They can split the earth. Never forget the spice sellers. They can tempt the tongue to sing. Never forget the kite makers. They can scissor the wind into streamers. Never forget the carpenters. They can build horses that breach walled cities. Never forget those who stretch hide into leather. They can craft drums that bring down palaces.
In Forrest Gander's beautiful quote, he says something about history will remember poets like Hoskote, and then he references Auden a little bit about how poetry makes nothing happen. And of course, in that same poem, if you follow down, it actually is saying the opposite, that actually poetry survives and it's the mouth. And I wonder, there is, I think most poets have some kind of crisis at some point, which is like, what's the point and why are we doing it? Because it feels, it feels like a Sisyphean task, and it feels, a little bit like, especially when you were mentioning Lala, that sense of she was writing during really turbulent times, and every every age feels turbulent, but I think we can safely say that this is pretty turbulent times. So then, what is the function of poetry in this moment of writing it, sending it into the world, or just as an archive, just in the way that you talk about the clay tablets in that gorgeous poem? Will our, I read about something about writers putting something in a little, I don't know, time capsule that will be discovered when we are not missed by whoever's there. And so yeah, do you see what I'm saying? It's many ideas, but it's this point of like, why are we plodding on? Why do we keep doing this?
Partly
Why do
because,
you?
well, oh my goodness, what is it Martin Luther says? Hier stehe ich kann nicht andere. Here I stand, I can do no other. And I think that at the base of it, this is true of those of us who work with our imagination and continue to explore and try and refine our craft, and we muddle along. And I think that is something we do because that is what we do. I don't think there's another explanation. But I think it's also really about attempting to find solidarities. It's, I think what we do is both this retreat into our own solitude, our own interiority, but also the hope, sometimes the vain and desperate hope maybe, but of connecting with others, with readers, and forming some kind of common ground. And I think increasingly that's become important to me. And again, it's something that's pulled out of the tradition. It's this idea of Kabir standing in the marketplace, Kabira khada bazar mein. Earlier on I used to think to myself, why is he rabbiting on about standing in the marketplace when clearly he has other places to be? But it's right there in the turbulence, in the rough and tumble, that you have to make your claim to be heard. I think that has become clear to me. But I think it's, if there's one thing that of the many lessons from the pandemic, if what I've learned as a poet is that we are not alone. It's been absolutely marvelous to read poets in other languages. This has been, or in other contexts. I mean, I was just making a list of what I read across 2020. It was Sasha Dugdale's fabulous new book, Deformations. It was Mangesh Narayan Rao Kale's book, Mayavi Tahrir, in a Marathi that he infuses with Persian and Arabic and makes both an aesthetic and a political point at this time. I went back to reading Kedarnath Singh. It was just a sense of being nourished by a diversity of poets with different questions and urgencies, different linguistic solutions. And in some sense, I think for us, it's also that awareness that, whilst we are isolated in our studies at our desks, there's this larger community that we'll always be part of.
One of my students last semester said something very beautiful about why she writes. She said, I write because I don't want to mourn alone. So that sense of accepting that the tone feels mournful now, especially environmentally. But yeah, not wanting to be alone, wanting to create, despite the fact that we can't see, we can't touch, we can't meet in a way that we would be. We have this two-dimensionality that we now have to use, but it still in some way offers us community. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about this idea, a very beautiful idea that Marina Tsvetaeva wrote about two types of poets, poet with history and poet without history. And she talks about the poet with history who is never looking back, is always going forward, is a straight arrow. And then she talks about the poet without history as being a circle. And these are the sort of lyric poets who are outside of any time. And it strikes me that maybe a lot of the poets that I'm reading now are a kind of mixture of these two, because there's this sense of immediacy that poetry has, elasticity, of being able to respond in a faster way than fiction to things that have been going on. But there is also an insistence upon the lyric, you
Yes.
know.
Fabulous. I mean, I like you. I think it's always going to be a mixture of these impulses. I don't know that we can even make the distinction that Tsvetaeva makes there, because as you were speaking, I suddenly thought, who am I thinking of here? Poets who have been incredibly important to me. Osip Mandelstam. I mean, he was as committed to shaping the lyric in the moment as he was to his what he saw as his deep historical contexts, whether it was going back to the history of the Russian old believers or reclaiming the Mediterranean, the poems in Tristia. There's so much power there that comes from the act of recalling, of retrieving, of going back into the deep contexts. And yet there's a forward moving impulse. You're shaping, you're making, you're taking pleasure in creating ingenious new forms. I think of Paul Celan. Uh, Anyone else, well, he did, in fact, eventually kill himself out of the horror of bearing that history. But I can imagine other people crumbling under that kind of historical pressure. And yet you have him producing these incredibly compressed, often elliptical poems. They're lyrics of the highest order. And yet they reach out of the individual self to speak for a people, for a country, for a continent, and speak to us wherever we are. You know, I mean, I sometimes hesitate to use the term universal because it then seems to become abstract. But this is universal in the most bodied, precise, visceral way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking also of poetic lineages and how we all create them as we go, and how in our firmament there might be one or two that are steady stars, some that are, momentarily they're what we need, and then we discard them, and it's like this conversation that we're having always with the dead, and with literature. And I think that that's really something wonderful. But I also think of the idea of community in real life, as in while we're still in bodies living now. And I feel like I want to ask you about this question of letters, because you responded to some of Khalid's letters to his friends in a poem. And I know that you yourself have received many letters from Bombay poet friends. And, is Snapchat going to be the next archive for poetry?
I've for years dreaded the publication of somebody's collected emails at some point. I don't know what else we're going to have from this period. But you're right. When I look back, I have letters from Aga Shahid Ali, from Jahangir Sabawala, the painter, beautifully crafted letters, and from two or three strange missives from Sousa, F.N. Sousa, who wrote in Olympian voice, promoting his particular religious convictions of the moment. But I don't know how all this is going to be archived for future reference. But I think that there's a particular kind of epistolary relationship that remains crucial. And I still think that even with emails, I think there are people who pour that kind of energy into it. And that's vital, especially now that we are distanced as we all are in this way. It becomes a record of the soul, if you will. And then when you think back to the Renaissance, for instance, in a one-line kind of description, we hear that two thinkers were friends. Then you realize they probably met just twice in their lives. And for the rest, it was the letters. So how do you extend yourself, your subjectivity? What is the common ground you create there? And it's not an illusion.
Yeah. But there have also been, I would say, particularly in cities, so in different time frames, a very rich flourishing of friendships, rivalries, literary communities, and I would say Bombay definitely features there, but also, you think of Paris, and then, Gertrude Stein and the salons and sitting in the same cafe, and New York, there have been London, there are these centers. And it used to be that, if you wanted to be a writer or a painter, you had to go to Paris, you had to go to wherever, the action was. And now, in a way, it feels democratized, because here I am sitting in my rural corner of Tamil Nadu, and I'm talking to you. And I don't need to pick up my life and go somewhere. And because of technology, however difficult it may be, it has given us this ability to make connection and community, however tenuous it may be. And I wonder, maybe if you could speak to the idea of your communities in Bombay, because we started with the idea of that being the sort of crucible, the place where all these things were layering into
Right.
all your work. And really, it is such a remarkable city. And I wonder how you feel about it now, as opposed to earlier, in the
Yeah.
70s or the late 60s.
Yeah. Um, for me, the formative moment would have been the late 80s and the early 90s,
Mm.
when there were several generations of poets active in Bombay. I mean, there still are, of course, generations of poets active, but this was like the heroic, legendary generation.
Yes.
So there were Nissim Ezekiel, Dom Moraes, Adil
Right.
Jasawala, Arun Kolatkar, Dilip Chitre came through, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra came through, there was Eunice D'Souza,
Eunice, yeah.
and I'm just naming a few of this constellation. Keki Daruwala would visit, A.K. Ramanujan would come down, Giv Patel. So it was a tremendous sense of being in the presence of these poets and their work. And that was one layer of the story for me. There was also, for me personally, and for some of us who were members of it, I think the Poetry Circle was, at least in its first phase from 1986 to roughly 1999, it was truly a laboratory, a cradle, a crucible. It was young poets getting together, reading and criticizing each other. It was very much that sort of life in and off poetry. When whatever else you did, you would meet regularly, you would read more. We also read other people's work. I think that's something that's critical. Just the fact that you have to keep building up your muscle, if you will, or building your muscle memory. So there was a lot of that. And also, I've come to appreciate this more and more with distance and time. I went to Elphinstone College, where the Marathi and the Gujarati departments were entirely populated by major writers in those languages. And just being around them, being at the multilingual readings that they organized, was fabulous. It also allowed for entry points into other worlds and other debates. For instance, with Gujarati poets, Prabodh Parikh, Kamal Vora, Ghulam Sheikh, to name but three. It was an entry point into another language which had come into the avant-garde before our Anglophone friends had done so. They knew Fluxus and so on well before even the Indian art world did. So it was also a very early realization that what we prized as this modernism that seemed to have, come to us as Anglophone poets had come to other people in other forms. It was available in different ways, and you needed to make that leap. So when I think back, it's all of these things that come into play. It was this cycling among different kinds of literary universes in the one city in the late 80s and through the 90s. That was vital to me. And
Do you
today it's an
feel that
expanded
still exists? Yeah,
maybe.
that
No, I think but I can't say. Maybe there's a younger generation now that has an equally vibrant or a life that has other kinds of vibrancies. But today, for me, it's a set of intersecting circles with friends and practitioners who might be in Delhi, who might be overseas. So it's no longer a sense of the historic Bombay poets. It's much more this larger archipelago of practitioners. Also, again, working across languages. I know I'm harping on this translingual sort of
No,
theme of
no.
mine, but it has
Yeah.
it has become truly vital.
I think that it's really interesting, that sense of the decentralizing or destabilizing of the power of certain geographies, which almost means that somebody who is not in the center of power has the chance to add their voice into the voices. But I do think about this question of community, and I think that that's really important for a poet, for any artist, for any human being, in fact, especially if you're making, and the uncertainty of the artistic path is to be able to actually have people, even if it's not writers, if you're hanging out with painters, or just like to sit and be able to have these conversations. So yeah, the question of community, whether it's geographical or cyber, I think is an important one, and that people care about. I think we can go. There's a lot of people listening, and there's a lot of questions. So perhaps I'll start looking at the questions, and Ranjit, you can do another reading, a short reading,
Sure,
and then I'll have some audience questions for you
sure. So
for
are
the
we?
last half hour.
Sounds great. So are we going to the questions now, or?
Not yet. If you do a reading,
Oh, that
I'll
sounds
try to, because there's lots of questions. So
okay. All right. Let me read a few poems. I'm going to read a poem called Ivory Bird, because when we were talking earlier about how do we heal, how do we mend, it's also for me a way of thinking back to the earliest rudimentary actions by which we as a species launched off on things that were generative. What was it like in the Stone Age? And I've been fascinated by those questions. What can we achieve with a minimum of means? So Ivory Bird is really a revisiting of Neolithic Germany, before Germany was ever invented, uh, based on a very, very small little sculpture found in the cave of Hohlefels. Ivory Bird goes like this. Nothing in the world except the rasp of adze, the scrape of gauge against the gutted mammoth's tusk, until your cup, cream ridged into feathers, wings folded back, legs pulled in, long neck, head, beak, a missile pointed at water far below or the clouds, the first cormorant ever sculpted in the sky of your palm. This one's called Pilgrim. Did I ever think heaven would ripen its doors before their right season, expecting me to arrive any day now, my boots caked with mud, my coat weighed down with rain, my lips moving to sounds not tethered yet to chants, more hostage than pilgrim, telling my story in bursts, how I let rivers surge through the trenches, how a thrown knife pinned me to a farewell, how I shrugged myself loose and ran, a banner rippling in and out of air, my hands burning with colors I'd scrounged off rocks, shrubs, spiky trees, on my way here, leaving my palms on outcrop and leaf, my soles on creased water. I'm going to read a poem before we go on to the questions, which is called, deliberately provocative title here, it's called Vernacular. And it's a word that I've certainly had highly ambivalent responses to, and I know many other people will, because, as you well know, of course, vernacular in a linguistic or a social context usually is pejorative. It speaks of not English. And it's a way of just doing down the Deshabhashas, languages that have their own rich history and practice. But in architecture, it actually has meaning and sense and significance. So it speaks of a robustly anchored and responsive way of building. So I was trying to play with and around these ideas in this poem, which is called Vernacular. And it goes like this. A vernacular year it's been, its walls laterite, lime in its veins, its rammed earth floor, embroidered with journeys across dunes and tides, its roof honeycombed with fables, in which terracotta horses take wing and dive. It began with a tremble in water, clay and speckled loam, shadows flicked off the giddy wheel, from a line of light traced along the turning lip of an urn, beaded celadon flames, marking the way home we gathered ourselves. Sing to us, months of passage, in a language not of slaves. Sing to us of the will to shape, never stop shaping.
So wonderful. Thank you, Ranjit. There's lots of questions. I think you can dive in there if you want as well, but I'll just feed you a few so that
Sure.
we're not wasting precious time since a lot of questions are here. I think here's a question. Poetry as a performance art. What is your view on poetry as a performance art, as in recited and heard rather than read?
Oh, fabulous question. I have no dispute with that whatever, which is why I've never quite understood the distinction, which I assume was made for tactical reasons, between so-called stage poetry and page poetry. Uh, I know this question has meaning in so-called spoken word circles, but I always think that the origins of our art is in the voice. It goes back to an oral tradition. It goes back to ritual theater. So I see no contradiction at all. I think there are things that you can do on the page. We've been talking about that. There are certain things you can do that print modernity allows in terms of mise en page. But eventually it comes back to performance. It comes back to the utterance, which is the bridge between you and your listeners and your readers.
There's an interesting question here about the fact that a lot of people, okay, this is from Neha. I have seen people around me see an art and say, I don't understand this painting. And I've seen them progress to at least saying, okay, I'll try. But when it comes to poems, I meet people who say, I don't understand your poem. How do I take them on a journey to try?
I'll link that to the earlier question. I think it's important to simply share with people the textures of utterance. I think it's important that as poets, we just invite people into the texture, the tonality of what we're doing, the cadence of it. Increasingly, I think these are crucial aspects of our art. And it might not be an immediate meaning. It might not just reveal itself instantly. Sometimes it might. But there's also something like, when I think about the visual arts and people say this to me and say, I just don't understand installation. I don't know what's going on here. And I would say there's also something like the beholder's share. You have to do some work as a viewer. So with respect, I would say, I think readers also have their work to do. And this is not unknown to the tradition. In every art, that the reader is also a practitioner. You're a practitioner of reading.
Yeah. I was going to also ask just separately, which something I think about is, why have we placed such a important emphasis on understanding immediately? You were talking about how books release themselves to us over the years. It's not that the first time you read something, you immediately, like getting it. Why maybe we need to change that idea that it's immediately gettable or it's immediately understandable, and that you can sit with the complexity and feel somewhat confused about why you're moved or something, like it speaks to me, but I can't tell you, like that's actually part of the process.
Absolutely.
And no?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Absolutely. I think that perplexity, bewilderment, something half glimpsed, these are crucial to our experience of reading. And also to realize that if you're really going to read, it's a commitment for your lifetime. And I felt this strongly again in the last couple of months. I realized that writers I had utterly dismissed when I was a teenager in my 20s are people who mean a great deal to me now. Thomas Hardy, I used to hold my head in my hands when I was 20 and say, do I have to read this unbelievably boring individual? And today I am so deeply moved by the psychological portraiture, by the bleak wisdom. And I've also been going back over Ishiguro's work, someone who's always appealed to me. I've loved his novels from when I first discovered them. And I just find the sonority, the wisdom, the recurrent themes, they just grow in importance. I've never gone away, and I've come into a deeper appreciation. But they're different temporalities. I mean, speaking of fiction here, but it's true of any art form. I mean, it's going to release itself differently in different ways, and if it doesn't, then maybe we need to be a bit anxious.
Yeah. Here's a curious question by an anonymous attendee. If a poet does not feel like sharing their poem, does that mean their poetry is not useful to the world, at least to the people around them? It's a bit like if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it. What is the, there is a privacy, right, to poetry. So maybe, that's an interesting question.
One part of me wants to say, if you want to safeguard your poems like that, keep them entirely for yourself, maybe they have a different function. Maybe they have a self-clarifying function, and maybe no one else ever needs to read them. But on the other hand, poets can be overtaken by historical accidents. I'm thinking here of Pessoa. Honestly, no one would have known that the man ever wrote, or the man and his God knows how many personae, his heteronyms, wrote all that stuff, because it was all in a tin trunk, right? Which was discovered by the executors of the will or his heirs. And his entire career has been a posthumous career.
So,
Dickinson, yeah, exactly. So the afterlife of poetry is something that I would regard as very precious.
Mm. And Manash has a beautiful comment. I'm just going to read it because it kind of ties into this. He says, Ranjit, you used the word uncanny when I was already thinking about Heidegger and his use of that word, taking from Freud, regarding his idea that under the spell of modernity, we have become homeless in language. Homecoming is forbidden territory. We dwell in the nightmares of territory. We lost our here, and now even our hopes of an elsewhere has thinned like the forest. History is galloping ahead without regrets. I wonder if Hunchprose is also Hunchpose and Hunchpoise. I am thinking of Mandelstam's expression of Leningrad that hunches like a wild cat. You just mentioned Mandelstam as I typed his name.
This is uncanny.
Can poetry, like Mandelstam thought, still deliver the message in the bottle across the sea? What a glorious comment.
That is a glorious comment. And I might just respond to some elements. It's just very beautiful. Thank you, Manash. Because Heidegger was invoked. I mean, these two words, I mean, German is one of my other languages. The two words that have possessed me for a long, long time. One of them is unheimlich, the uncanny, but it's also the unhomely, something that's not, it's going to make you uncomfortable. And you suddenly wonder, well, what is it that's under the floor? What is it that's on the roof? And the other word is Heimkehrung, a homecoming, but it's a circling back to home. So I love that idea of the journey that's a circle that comes back, and maybe it's not the same place that you started from. So the transformations of the Heimkehrung, the circling back to home, are also something that I find incredibly unpredictable yet nourishing. So absolutely. And I think we're all committed to the messages we put into bottles and throw out into the ocean and hope someone gets them. Or what we've put on the golden record going out into deep space on, was it the Voyager probe? I mean, somewhere out there, someone we don't know is hopefully listening to Kesar by Kerkar on the golden record.
This is a question that's interesting. I think it's asked by Rohan. There's a lot of questions here, but do you write sometimes lines you don't like? And then where's the rest of the question? What happened? Oh yeah, does it happen sometimes that you write lines that you do not like? What is it that you don't like about your work?
Oh my goodness. Too many sins there to enumerate about what I don't like about my work. But because I have this strange stop-start technique of the fragments and notations that build up in notebooks, the lines that I don't like just simply remain there, they get crossed out. Sometimes I have to say I find lines that I don't like in older published work, and then I say to myself, good grief, someday if there's a chance, I'll change this. So, but that is, by the grace of the gods of poetry, that's happening less and less. But 5 years from now, I might just turn around and say, you know what, I need to fix this. So it's a work in progress, yeah. But typically, if I'm unhappy with a line, it's crossed out and I don't go back to it.
And I guess there's a question to be asked about, I mean, yeah, the very famous line of Verlaine that, the poem is never finished, it's abandoned. And at some point you feel, okay, I must move on. And then, but it's never ever done completely, yes. Right? Absolutely. 5 years later, you're just thinking, oh, why is that word there? Yes. Why is that comma there? But a question about language. How do you as a linguist feel about using multiple languages in poem?
Well, thank you for the question. I pushed that a little in Jonah Whale, where you have a long poem, which is actually inscribed over a chapter from a Melville novel, Redburn, which is, there are cancellations, there's sotto voce, and then there are bandish lines from Tumris and Kajris. And that was, for me, it was sort of theater. It was like an opera. I really wanted to bring in these languages that we have kept outside of the framework of our English. I wanted to see what that felt like. What is it to have Braj, Bhojpuri, Awadhi coming in? What is the language universe that then comes into play? And I have personally no real problem with this. If it's relevant to the fabric of the poem, I would do it. Also, something that I learned, I think, from translation. Because there are times when you realize that there will never be a perfect correspondence of one word to another. And sometimes you just import that word. And that is, in fact, the history of English. I think there is one part of us which is still caught up with colonial pedagogy and the idea of mastering a language. But we know this. English has always been a highly absorbent osmotic language. So you might want to, as I did, go back to the old Norse and Anglo-Saxon origins. But the last 400 years of the language, it's just gone out and been transformed by the people who've used it, their vocabularies, their glossaries. No reason for us to stop that process now.
Yeah. This is a sort of follow-up question by Saurabha Rao, and it's interesting because it talks about translation, and the question is, how do you navigate the mindscape of the author or poet that you translate, and how do the complexities of language offer themselves to your inward journey when you put your head down on a blank sheet of paper? Maybe talk a little bit about it would be interesting to talk about the experience of translating Lala, and then now you're talking about Mir, and so, or like two processes and how different they are,
With Lala, it was a profound sense of responsibility to the language and to the different plural pasts of Lala. And that was because the 20 years in which I worked on that were also some of the worst years for Kashmir. So there was a tremendous sense of having an ethical and a political responsibility as a translator. It wasn't only about the texts. And I think that all those impulses came together at some point through research when that breakthrough came, that actually this was the work of an intergenerational ensemble of contributors. It seemed it was an extremely democratic model of how this corpus has come into being. And it really worked beautifully at different levels for me. As a translator, my challenge there began when I was in my early 20s and caught up with this particular kind of politics. So I thought to myself, what am I going to do with all this yogic and tantric vocabulary, or the Sufi vocabulary, which is there? So the first few years were caught up, uselessly enough, in trying to find worldly equivalents. And I was transformed by the process. I realized that far from seeking worldly equivalents, I need to break myself and enter that world. So I say that in my introduction, the translator is broken and remade by the act of translation. So that was a lesson in humility, a lesson in exploring and navigating those worlds of mystical experience, spiritual practice. And that took me on a certain journey, which was eventually also a very plural journey. It was a journey into a plural spirituality. and respect for the fact that very bodied practices of transcendence had informed this work, and I needed to bear that in mind. With Mir, somewhat more proximate, yet no less mysterious. What I prize and cherish in Mir is the extraordinary diversity of his language. We are, again, there's a political aspect to it. We are today in a situation where his language is sought to be identified with a particular group, whilst actually it was widely spoken, widely written in, and widely diverse. Mir has elements of Braj, he has elements of, and he called his own language Hindi, by the way. So reading him and translating him has also been translating all his diversity, his registers, his tonality, the word choices he makes, the playfulness, the irony. And also, it's in each case, you're up against a certain tradition of interpretation and translation. I think in the case of Lalla, I was working with and against a tradition of ornate Victorian idiom, which has been reserved for sacred writing from the East. In Mir's case, it's been looking at those poems and looking at a body of scholarship that has seen the ghazal universe as separate from the historical world.
Yeah.
And you look at it, it's full of, he lived through extremely violent times. And when I translate those poems, I can't help but think, yes, this is a man who saw his beloved city, Delhi, being destroyed by invasion, who left and went away. The images of the refugees, of violence, of a city collapsing, these are powerful in that work. And again, you realize with a shock that this resonates for us today. His world and our world are not that different.
I have my own question and another question about translation. But is it different physically to hold these poets while you're working on them, or just is there a difference in your body actually? So if you're working on Lalla, or if you're working on, is there a bodily feeling as well, or is it in the head?
I think it's
purely?
a bodily feeling too. Again,
Okay.
I can't explain this easily, but I do sense a difference in how I respond. And seems like a strange, reverent thing to say, but I do find myself sitting up in somewhat more yogic manner when I'm translating, be that Lalla or Mir.
Okay.
It's you just feel that you need to be well centered and attentive, in the fullest way, releasing yourself through all your senses.
That's so interesting. So I'm going to ask you a question. This is from Bilal Tanveer. Dear Ranjit, thank you for sharing these poems and your thoughts. I want to draw attention to the space of translation, where something is lost in translation. That's the moment and space where the translator gains an opportunity to bring something to the original. I'm wondering if you could share an instance or two from your translation practice, how you found something in the moment of losing something you were translating. Beautiful question.
Beautiful question. Bilal, thank you. It's great to know you're here with us this evening. I have had this experience. Unfortunately, I can't immediately leap out to examples, but it's typically taken the form of recognizing that there could be no correspondence. And yet suddenly there's a playful pun in the language that I'm taking the poem to, which sort of makes up for the deficit of the turn of phrase that I'm not able to carry across. And it's to me, those kinds of prompts, it's like a long dead poet suddenly sort of reaches out to you and says, try this. So I wish I had examples immediately at hand, but I'm trying to think of something that it's definitely happened to me in the Mir translations quite a bit, where there's something in the poet's playfulness where you receive permission to do this. Now, I wish I had a concrete example to offer immediately, but...
Have you written extensively essays on translation, Ranjit?
Not really. I mean,
Well, you should. Publishers, you should commission this book. I think it's fascinating and people want to know about it. And it's really a sort of the behind the process of translation. It's an extraordinary thing. It's a sort of parallel life, a parallel literary pursuit. And you work in so many languages. So I think this question of body and what happens and the space, all of that is something, your next project,
I will keep that in mind.
or one of the many projects.
Thank you.
Okay, here's a short, quick fire question. Ranjit, which is your favorite Hindi word?
My favorite Hindi word, I can tell you
Mm.
right away, is Zameen,
Okay.
which some might
Why?
argue is an Urdu word. Why? Because it is one of those incredibly, oh my God, I feel the scholarly fever coming on, a polysemous word. It's a
Mm.
word that just releases itself in different ways and it defies translation. Actually, it appears in some of my poems that it just appears as Zameen. It could be earth, it could be territory, it could be the land where your ancestors have lived or from where they've migrated. It could mean a mahal of home. There's no way to translate this word. It challenges and nurtures in the same moment. So it's long been my favorite word. Earth, home, space of belonging, lost homeland, all of the above.
Wonderful. How wonderful that you had a answer right away. That's tough to do those questions, I think. Um, okay, here's an interesting question by an anonymous attendee. Who are we while writing poetry, and what do we become after writing a poem?
I think maybe I embrace that question and its seriousness, but I think we write because we are trying to find out who we are. And additively, incrementally, with stops and starts, backsliding and moving forward, that is probably why we write, because we're trying to find out who we are and shaping. It's an act of self-fashioning.
Yeah. And what happens to the, is there something that the poem, once it's written, allows us to be? Is it some kind of bridge, or are we like snakes? We keep shedding skin and we transform all the time? Is it a mixture of all those
I
things?
think it's a mixture of both those things. I mean, we do slough off our skins and move on to other avatars. But I think also it is a bridge, it's at least a threshold. So literally, as anthropologists would say, I think a poem is a liminal space. It's the space of the limen, the threshold. You're trying out different roles, personae, and you're transforming yourself.
Yeah, I love threshold as a word, actually. There's a lot of questions here which I'll sort of paraphrase, since we can't possibly get to all of them, but there's just questions which are fundamental, basic questions, which are: how does one understand the context of poetry better and appreciate it better? Or how do we know whether a poem is good or bad? What makes a poem a poem? I mean, Dickinson's definition was that it has to blow the top of her head off. And I wonder, can we talk about that? Like, how do you define what makes a poem, what makes a good poem for you? What is a good poem?
Over the years, I've realized the impossibility of one-stop kind of definition, because poems don't all set out to do the same thing. Some might haunt us forever. Some might leave a trace and then you come back to them. Some might move us instantly. Some have linguistic pyrotechnics going for them. Some have a deeper, maybe bleaker wisdom. But they all have to have, as maybe every artwork does, they need to have a certain inexhaustibility. They need to be able to just resonate for us in mysterious ways. And, we need to reach out. At the end, we need to reach out and say, God, I didn't get that. I'll need to come back. I think far from being perplexed and saying, I don't understand it, maybe the thing is, yeah, I didn't understand it and I'm going to try and figure out why. That's a kind of really artisanal working definition. But when I think of poems by Adrian Rich, James Merrill, Paul Celan, indeed, things that have resonated for me for many, many years, and then you come back and, they read in different ways sometimes. The emphasis shifts.
Yeah.
And you're it's like a mirror. You're seeing yourself change in the mirror of the poem.
That's lovely. Okay. Does poetry, this is from Gayatri, does poetry come off as a tool of culture or a catalyst towards causing a certain cultural wave towards the audience? And if yes, how has that, according to you, taken course throughout history?
Okay, you know what? Again, I think it's a vital question that many of us are pondering over, but I did actually decline an invitation to an Art World conference where I had been invited to speak on poetry as a tool of
Mm.
culture. I reacted badly because it
Wonder
was,
why?
yeah, I just said,
No, no, but yeah.
no, I was going to say, I'm not going to, first of all, it's not an instrument. I'm not going to participate in an instrumentalization of an art that is central to me. And I'm not going to do it in a context where, particularly in the world of the visual arts, there's a constant turning towards other things, the linguistic turn, the pedagogical turn, the institutional turn. At some point, you want to say, why don't you turn back and look at whatever is germane to the visual arts? And you might find something that you've skipped in all of this running around. And for Christ's sake, don't try and instrumentalize the other arts. They have their own materiality and spirit, and they're doing other things. So I would, rather than apply categories like tool and catalyst, I would try and I'll hold on to those other more masonry oriented images we had, the threshold, the bridge. I do think that it's important as some form of seeking and forming solidarity or community. So to that extent, absolutely. But I think we always need to be aware that it's not going to be a tool that's going to do what we want it to do. It's a tool with its own mind. It's got an unpredictability of its own.
Yeah. So this is a question: when it comes to canon and legacy, how are poets across the generations informing each other's craft? We've spoken a little bit about this. Yeah. On the space on each page between the poems, did you intend the space to speak for silence, the absence of response, perhaps? This is from Shobana Kumar.
A pause, a silence, a change of tempo, again, pursuing my musical obsessions, seeing if the poem on the page could act like a score. And if you as a reader could bring your own tempo to it. Something that's fascinated me, for instance, is how different conductors have calibrated what look like absolutely set in stone scores differently. And over the years, I've just been listening to some of these recordings, and you think, my goodness, is that the same piece of music? How do you speed something up? How do you pull it back? What kind of pauses do you introduce? So those are the kinds of experiments that inform the white spaces in the book.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions which kind of tie in with the idea of, the question of the role that writers and poets, and it sort of has an echo with the tool thing, because it feels like it's some kind of social responsibility. And I know that a lot of writers and poets do feel very strongly. Maybe it would be a moment to sort of talk a little bit about that thing that I brought up, that idea that, which the poetry changes nothing, or the durability of poetry despite its apparent uselessness in our society. Maybe speak a little bit about, if not changing, say, actual laws, or to sway judicial opinion, which poetry maybe can't do that, but how is poetry, or how can poetry work in society in this moment, to offer something that is very valuable to us?
I think poetry, like all the arts, is an invitation to remain open to a diversity of stimuli, possibilities, to approach a space of exchange. Our world is altogether overridden today by certitudes. There is just too many people who are extremely certain of what the world needs to be, and they're pushing it down everybody else's throats. So if poetry can do anything at all, I think it's a way of transforming consciousness. It's a way of thinking about a different way of looking at the world, being in the world, of not necessarily being absolutely certain of who we are and what we need to do. I think we need to introduce some of these hesitancies into the way we are, to create space for considering alternatives.
Yeah.
This idea of the civic imagination is something that's been precious to me for a long time. I mean, how do we as citizens retain the agency to imagine alternatives, social, cultural, political? It's an idea that Henry Jenkins put in place quite a while ago. So I think poetry definitely has a role to play in that kind of civic imagination. How might we
That,
consider the
yeah.
otherwise, the alternative?
So beautiful. And unfortunately, I think we've run out of time. There were questions that I couldn't get to, but I hope that this has been a rich and rewarding conversation for you. It has been for me. Thank you, Ranjit.
Thank you so much, Tishani. Really, really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ranjit, Tishani, for this. I mean, it's a tough act to follow. I mean, Ranjit, congratulations on the launch of this wonderful new book. And to our participants who took part in our wonderful book giveaway contest, we had an overwhelming response of that. So, congratulations to the lucky winners. Tishani, thank you for so skillfully anchoring, moderating. I mean, we had over 50 questions. And also to our partners, Penguin Random House, Literature Live, Anil Amy, Kitab Khana, for partnering with us and spreading the word. And to our participants, we've had such an overwhelming response to the session. We have many more programs planned for Avid. The next one is on cultural and digital diplomacy in a global crisis next Thursday on the 25th, and many more to come. To find out more of our programs, just follow us on social media at Avid Learning or our website. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and remember, learning never stops. Thank you once again, Tishani. Thank you, Ranjit, and good night.
Thank you so much. This is
Pleasure.
really wonderful. Take care. Bye.